Most people assume that empaths with few friends are lonely, that something went wrong somewhere, that they're too sensitive for the world, too wounded to connect, too broken to maintain relationships the way normal people do. And that assumption is so widespread, so deeply embedded in how we think about friendship and belonging, that even empaths themselves start to believe it. They look at their small circle, their quiet weekends, the phone that rarely rings, and they think something must be fundamentally wrong with them. Jung noticed that his most psychologically perceptive patients, the ones with the deepest capacity for genuine connection, almost always had the fewest relationships. And the reason wasn't damage or dysfunction. The reason was something far more interesting and far more unsettling to people who measure human worth by the size of someone's social circle. He recognized that certain people possess psychological traits so rare and so demanding that most human beings simply cannot tolerate sustained closeness with them. Not because these people are difficult in the way we usually mean, but because who they are, at their core, creates an experience of relating that most people find deeply uncomfortable without being able to articulate why. They just know they feel exposed. They feel seen in ways they didn't consent to. They feel unable to perform the way they perform around everyone else, and so they drift. They pull back. They stop calling. What's left is the empath, standing in the quiet, wondering what they did wrong. But Jung would have said they didn't do anything wrong. They did something rare. They remained themselves, and most of the world isn't built for that. Today I'm going to walk you through the 5 specific traits Jung identified in empaths who consistently end up with small social circles. Why each of these traits makes maintaining large numbers of friendships nearly impossible, and why possessing these traits isn't a sign that something's broken in you, but a sign that something is functioning exactly the way it's supposed to. The first trait is involuntary authenticity, and this one is harder to live with than it sounds. Most people can perform. They can show up to a dinner party and play the version of themselves that fits. They can laugh at jokes that aren't funny, agree with opinions they don't hold, maintain conversations that bore them to the point of pain, and do all of it smoothly enough that nobody notices. Social performance is so normal, so automatic for most people, that they don't even register they're doing it. It's just what you do. You show up, you adjust, you blend. Empaths with this trait cannot do this. Not because they've decided to be radically honest, or because they've adopted some philosophy about living authentically. It's deeper than choice. Their nervous system rejects performance. When they try to fake interest, their body language betrays them. When they try to laugh at something hollow, the sound comes out wrong and everyone hears it. When they try to agree with something they don't believe, something in their face shifts and the room gets uncomfortable. Jung would have understood this as a failure of the persona, his term for the social mask everyone wears to navigate public life. Most people develop a flexible, adaptive persona in childhood. They learn which version of themselves gets approval, which gets safety, which gets belonging, and they switch between versions fluidly, often without awareness. But empaths who develop involuntary authenticity usually grew up in environments where performing was so psychologically costly, where the gap between the mask and the truth became so unbearable that their psyche eventually refused to maintain the split. The persona didn't just crack, it dissolved in certain critical places. And what's left is someone who can only show up as who they actually are, in real time, with whatever they're actually feeling visible on their face and audible in their voice. This sounds like a virtue until you realize what it costs socially, because most friendships run on a thin layer of mutual performance. I'll pretend your story is interesting if you pretend mine is. I'll act like I'm not bored if you act like you're not either. Most social bonding happens in this shared performance space, and people who can't enter it get quietly excluded. The empath with involuntary authenticity sits at the table, and everyone senses something is off. They're not rude, they're not cold, but they're not playing the game. And that absence of performance creates a subtle discomfort that most people resolve by simply spending less time with the empath. No confrontation, no explanation, just a slow fade. Invitations stop, texts get shorter, and the empath is left wondering what happened, when what happened is that they were too real for a room full of people who needed the performance to feel safe. People with this trait didn't lose friends because they were unlikable. They lost friends because their authenticity created an unspoken pressure on everyone around them to also be authentic. And most people aren't ready for that. Most people need their masks. Their social performances aren't shallow or cowardly. They're protective. And when someone shows up who can't perform, it disrupts the silent agreement that keeps everyone comfortable. The second trait is what Jung would have called energetic discernment, though he spoke about it in terms of psychic selectivity. This is the empath's nervous system acting as a filter so precise that it rejects connections most people would accept without question. Here's how this works. Most people evaluate potential friendships on surface criteria. Is this person fun? Do we share interests? Are they available when I want company? Do they make me feel good? These are reasonable filters, and they produce a wide range of possible connections. You can be friends with lots of people when your filtering criteria are this broad. Empaths with energetic discernment are filtering on an entirely different level. Before conscious thought even engages, their nervous system has already assessed whether someone's energy is congruent, whether the person's words match their internal state, whether the warmth being offered is genuine or performed, whether the connection being proposed has real substance or is just proximity dressed up as intimacy. And their nervous system makes this assessment with terrifying speed. Within minutes of meeting someone, the empath knows, not thinks, knows. This person is safe, or this person isn't. This connection has depth, or it doesn't. This friendship would cost more than it gives, or it would be real. Jung found that this kind of rapid, unconscious assessment wasn't paranoia or judgment. It was pattern recognition operating below the threshold of conscious awareness. The empath system was processing microsignals, incongruences between tone and content, subtle energetic shifts, the particular quality of someone's attention, and assembling all of it into a verdict that arrived as a feeling in the body rather than a thought in the mind. The problem is that this filter is brutally narrow. When your nervous system can detect performed warmth, you can't accept it as real just because it would be nice to have more friends. When your body registers that someone's interest in you is actually about what you can provide for them, you can't override that signal to avoid being alone on Friday night. People without this trait can maintain dozens of casual friendships because their filter lets casual through. The empath's filter doesn't. It's looking for something most people rarely offer: genuine, energetic congruence. Someone whose inside matches their outside. Someone whose presence doesn't require the empath to constantly translate between what's being said and what's actually meant. And when you can only accept connections that pass this level of scrutiny, your social world gets very small, very fast. Not because you're picky in the superficial sense, because your system has requirements for safety and authenticity that most human interactions simply don't meet. Jung saw this as a form of psychological self-preservation that had become involuntary. These empaths weren't choosing to be selective, their nervous system was choosing for them. And fighting that system, forcing yourself into friendships your body has already rejected, produces a specific kind of exhaustion that empaths know well. The exhaustion of being around people your own system is telling you aren't safe, aren't real, aren't home. The third trait is depth hunger, and this is the one that makes empaths feel most alien in ordinary social settings. Picture a conversation. Someone's telling you about their vacation, where they stayed, what they ate, how the weather was. Most people can engage with this. They'll share their own vacation story. They'll ask questions about the hotel. The conversation flows because both people are comfortable operating on the surface. The empath with depth hunger is sitting in this conversation slowly suffocating. Not because the other person is boring, not because vacations aren't interesting, but because something in them is starving for the conversation underneath the conversation. They want to know why this person needed that vacation so badly, what they were running from when they booked the flight. Whether the beauty they saw made them feel alive or just reminded them how numb they've become. They want the real thing, the actual exchange, the moment where two people stop narrating their lives and start revealing them. Jung understood this as a fundamental orientation toward the unconscious rather than the conscious layer of experience. Most people live primarily on the surface, not because they're shallow, but because the surface is where social life functions efficiently. Small talk, shared activities, casual updates. These are the currency of normal friendship, and they work. They create bonds, provide belonging, fill time. But empaths with depth hunger can't metabolize this currency. It passes through them without nourishing anything. They can sit through hours of surface conversation and leave feeling more isolated than when they arrived. Because for them, connection doesn't happen through shared information. It happens through shared depth. Through the moment someone drops their narrative and says something true. Through the silence after a real confession. Through the look in someone's eyes when they stop performing and just exist in front of you. This trait doesn't make empaths superior conversationalists. It often makes them awkward ones. They'll ask a question that's too deep for the context. They'll respond to someone's casual story with an observation that makes the room go quiet. They'll try to steer toward meaning in a conversation designed for lightness, and everyone will feel the shift and pull back. And here's what Jung found so painful about this pattern. The empath isn't trying to make things heavy. They're trying to connect. Depth is their language of connection. But it's a language most people don't speak fluently, and attempting to speak it in casual settings makes the empath seem intense, overwhelming, or just strange. So they learn to stay quiet. They learn to nod and smile through surface conversations, performing engagement they don't feel. And afterward, they go home and sit with a hunger that never got fed, a loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone and everything to do with being surrounded by people they couldn't actually reach. The result is predictable. Friendships that run entirely on surface interaction eventually die because the empath stops being able to sustain them. They can't keep showing up to connections where they leave feeling emptier than they arrived. So the friendships thin out. And what remains are the rare people who can go deep, who can meet them in the place where real exchange happens. Those friendships are often extraordinary, but there are very, very few of them. If what you're hearing right now is stirring something in you, something that's been sitting unnamed for a long time, you might find real value in our guide, True Self-Discovery. It's built around 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, designed to help you stop performing and start understanding who you actually are beneath the noise. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. The fourth trait is shadow visibility. And this one is perhaps the most isolating of all because it operates without the empath's permission. Jung spent decades exploring what he called the shadow, the collection of traits, impulses, wounds, and desires that a person has rejected and pushed out of conscious awareness. Everyone has a shadow, and in most interactions, the shadow stays hidden. People present their persona, their curated self, and others respond to that presentation. The shadow remains backstage. Empaths with this fourth trait make the shadow visible. Not intentionally, not through confrontation or analysis, simply by being present. Something about the quality of their attention, the depth of their perception, the way they listen, causes other people's carefully maintained facades to become transparent. The person performing confidence suddenly feels their insecurity showing. The person projecting kindness senses their resentment leaking through. The person who has spent years building an image of having it together suddenly feels, in the empath's presence, like everything they're hiding is on display. This is not something the empath is doing to people. It's something that happens around them. Jung would have understood this as a consequence of the empath's own shadow work. When someone has faced their own darkness, when they've integrated rejected parts of themselves, they stop unconsciously participating in the collective agreement to keep everyone's shadows hidden. They're not hiding their own shadow anymore, and that honesty creates a field where other people's shadows start surfacing too. The experience for the other person is deeply unsettling. They might not be able to name what they're feeling. They just know they feel uncomfortable, exposed, somehow caught. And the natural human response to feeling exposed is either aggression or retreat. Some people get defensive around the empath. They become critical, dismissive, subtly hostile. Others just disappear. They stop calling. They find reasons to be busy. They drift toward people who feel safer, meaning people around whom their shadow can stay hidden. The empath usually has no idea this is happening. They just notice that people seem to withdraw from them for no apparent reason. Friendships that start well gradually cool. New connections that seem promising fizzle without explanation. And the empath searches for what they did wrong, reviews conversations for mistakes, wonders if they were too much or not enough. But Jung would have told them the truth. You didn't do anything wrong. Your presence asked something of people that they weren't ready to give. It asked them to be seen as they actually are. And most people aren't ready for that. Most people need relationships where their persona is accepted as their real self, where nobody looks too closely, where the agreement is that we'll both pretend, and that pretending is what we'll call friendship. The empath who makes shadows visible can't participate in this agreement. Their way of seeing is too honest, not judging, not analyzing, just perceiving. And that honest perception, even when it's completely silent, even when the empath says nothing about what they see, creates a pressure that most people resolve by leaving. What remains are the rare individuals who have done enough of their own shadow work to be comfortable being seen fully. People who don't need their shadows hidden. People who find the empath's presence not threatening but liberating, because for the first time, someone is seeing all of them and not running. Those friendships, when they form, are some of the deepest bonds two humans can share, but they're extraordinarily rare. The fifth trait is sovereign self-containment, and this is the one that confuses everyone, including the empath themselves. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming psychologically whole, of integrating the disparate parts of the psyche into a functioning, autonomous self. Most people never fully individuate. They remain dependent on external sources for identity, validation, emotional regulation, and a sense of meaning. Their friendships are partly genuine connection and partly infrastructure. They need people, not just because they enjoy them, but because without them, the architecture of their identity starts to wobble. Empaths who reach a certain stage of individuation develop something that looks, from the outside, like they don't need anyone. They can sit alone for hours and not feel empty. They can go weeks without social contact and feel not lonely, but restored. They can enjoy their own company in a way that most people find either impressive or disturbing, depending on how dependent those people are on external connection. This self-containment isn't coldness or avoidance. It's the result of having developed an internal relationship with themselves that's rich enough to sustain them. They've done the work of meeting their own shadow, integrating their own contradictions, building an inner life that provides what most people seek from other people: meaning, reflection, understanding, companionship even. The companionship of knowing yourself deeply enough that being alone doesn't mean being abandoned. But here's what this trait costs. When you don't need people, people sense it. And being around someone who doesn't need you is unsettling for people whose relational model is based on mutual need. Most friendships contain an unspoken exchange. I need you to make me feel interesting. You need me to make you feel valued. I need you to fill my evenings. You need me to confirm your identity. This exchange isn't conscious, and it isn't unhealthy in moderate amounts. It's just how most friendship works. The self-contained empath disrupts this exchange. They enjoy your company, but they don't need it. They value the friendship, but they won't collapse without it. They're present when they're with you, but they don't chase you when you're not. And this lack of need, this absence of the usual gravitational pull that holds friendships in orbit, makes people feel strangely unmoored. People often interpreted this self-containment as rejection. If you don't need me, you must not value me. If you're fine without me, I must not matter. The self-contained empath is often accused of being distant, aloof, not invested, when what they actually are is complete enough within themselves that their friendships are chosen rather than needed. And chosen friendships have a different quality than needed ones. They're less frequent but more intentional, less obligatory but more present. The empath doesn't show up out of duty or fear of abandonment. They show up because they genuinely want to be there. And when they don't want to be there, they don't show up. This honesty of presence is beautiful in theory and deeply uncomfortable in practice for people who are accustomed to the reliable performance of social obligation. The result is that people gradually stop reaching out, not because the empath is unkind, but because the usual mechanisms of friendship maintenance, the guilt-driven check-ins, the obligation-fueled invitations, the need-based attachments, don't work on someone who is genuinely self-contained. Without those mechanisms, most friendships simply stop generating enough momentum to sustain themselves, and the empath's circle shrinks further. Not toward emptiness, toward precision. Now here's what Jung found when he looked at all 5 of these traits together. They aren't separate phenomena. They're interconnected expressions of the same underlying psychological process. Individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who the world needs you to be. Involuntary authenticity is what happens when you've integrated enough of yourself that your persona can no longer maintain performances your psyche has outgrown. Energetic discernment is what happens when your nervous system has been refined by enough experience to recognize the difference between genuine and performed connection. Depth hunger is what happens when your inner life has developed to the point where surface exchange can no longer reach you. Shadow visibility is what happens when you've done enough of your own shadow work that you stop participating in the collective denial that keeps everyone else's shadows hidden. And sovereign self-containment is what happens when you've built a relationship with yourself strong enough that external validation becomes optional rather than essential. Each of these traits in isolation narrows your social world. Together, they reduce it to a handful of people at most. And this is where Jung's perspective becomes so important, because without it, the empath looks at their small circle and sees evidence of failure. They see the empty chairs at their table and feel the weight of what they assume they've lost. But Jung would have seen it differently. He would have seen those empty chairs as evidence of a psyche that has stopped compromising, a self that has become too integrated to fragment itself across dozens of shallow connections. A consciousness that has grown beyond the need for the constant social validation that drives most human bonding. This doesn't mean empaths with few friends don't experience loneliness. They do. But it's a specific kind of loneliness. The loneliness of someone who could fill their life with people tomorrow if they were willing to perform. The loneliness of choosing authenticity over belonging. The loneliness of standing in truth and watching most people walk away from it. That loneliness is real, and it's painful. But it's a different pain than the one that comes from being alone because no one wants you. This is the pain of being alone because you won't abandon yourself anymore, and that distinction matters. Because the empath who understands this distinction stops trying to fix themselves, stops wondering what's wrong with them, stops forcing themselves into social situations that drain them just to prove they're normal. They start to recognize that their small circle isn't a symptom of brokenness, it's a consequence of wholeness, or at least of moving toward wholeness in a world where wholeness is rare and therefore poorly understood. The empaths who made peace with this, who stopped measuring their worth by the number of friendships they could maintain, often experienced a profound shift. They stopped grieving the connections they'd lost and started honoring the ones they had. The 2 or 3 people who could actually meet them in authentic, deep, shadow-aware, sovereign connection became more valuable than any crowd ever was. And those relationships, freed from the performance and obligation that characterize most friendships, became something extraordinary. Not perfect, but real. Fully real, in a way that most people never experience because they're too busy maintaining the fiction. There's a grief that comes with accepting this. A mourning for the social life you were told you should want. The big friend group, the constant plans, the texts that never stop, the sense of being woven into a web of people who can't get through the week without you. That version of friendship is real for some people, and there's nothing wrong with it. But it was never available to you, not because you're broken, but because your psyche is wired for something else, something rarer, something that most people will never understand because they've never needed to. Jung would have told you that the path of individuation is not the path of popularity, that becoming whole often means becoming singular, that the more fully you inhabit yourself, the fewer people can inhabit the space beside you, because that space now has requirements that most humans can't meet, not through any fault of their own, just because they're on a different path, with different needs, operating from a different depth. Your few friendships aren't evidence that you failed at being human. They're evidence that you've succeeded at being yourself. And the world may never understand that distinction. The people who drift away will never know why they left. The ones who stay will never fully grasp how rare they are. And you'll sit in your quiet rooms, in your small circle, in your deep solitude, and some nights it will feel unbearable. And other nights it will feel like the only honest thing in a world running on performance. Both feelings are true. Jung would have said, hold both. Don't collapse into the pain and decide you're broken. Don't inflate the solitude and decide you're enlightened. Just be what you are. Someone whose traits make large-scale social life impossible and deep connection inevitable. Someone who lost the crowd but kept the real ones. Someone whose empty chairs aren't a wound, but a boundary your own psyche drew around what it's willing to accept. That's what these 5 traits are. Not flaws, not damage, not things to fix or overcome or heal your way out of. They're the psychological fingerprint of someone whose consciousness has developed past the point where most social contracts still make sense. And if you carry them, you already know everything I've said today. You've felt it in every room you've left early, every friendship that faded without explanation, every night you chose solitude over performance. You just didn't know there was a name for it. You didn't know Jung had seen people exactly like you and hadn't tried to fix them. He'd tried to understand them. And what he understood was that the empath with few friends is often the most psychologically whole person in any room they enter. They just happen to be standing in rooms built for a kind of connection they've already outgrown. If something in this resonated with a part of you that's been quiet for a long time, our guide, True Self-Discovery, might be worth your time. 24 reflection exercises built around Jung's work, designed not to fix you, but to help you finally understand what you already are. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.